Good evening. I'm Sebastian Barbosa, and you're watching NostradamusX News. Brace yourselves, because today we're not just going to read headlines, we're going to try to separate what's fact, what's social media smoke, and what is, unfortunately, the smoke of real explosions. The world we woke up to today, on this sixth day of war, is not the same world as a week ago. We've entered one of those turning points where history stops being a well-behaved chapter and becomes a collection of chaotic events. Today is the sixth day of conflict involving Iran, and this is our fifth episode, and we'll probably keep covering it until the end, if nothing worse happens, or if we don't get arrested for saying too much, chuckles. So, let's get to what matters. Don't fool yourselves into thinking this is a conflict far away. We're facing a chain of events that hits your front door directly. The price of your food, your electricity bill, market security, and even the cybercrime circling your phone. And while the world rethinks maps, maritime routes, and even the very concept of sovereignty, I'm looking at the Brazilian government under a magnifying glass. Honestly, it feels like we have leaders living inside a bubble of official letterhead, oblivious to the fact that war in 2026 is simultaneous, hybrid, and, when all else fails, brutally kinetic, the chessboard of World War III. Let me be very clear with you. In my strategic reading, the world is already living through a kind of slow-motion World War III. Don't expect 1939, with armored divisions marching in a straight line across Europe. In 2026, the global architecture is being stress-tested across multiple chessboards at once. Fronts open and close. Alliances appear under labels like logistical support or sanctions, but the end result is the same. The cost landing in your real life, from fertilizer to maritime insurance. At the center of this earthquake is Iran, a state many like to paint as a movie villain, but which operates with a cold regional strategy, using indirect arms to strike sensitive energy points and navigation routes. In the last few hours, we've had a high-impact event. The International Atomic Energy Agency confirmed that the entrances of the underground Natanz facility suffered damage. There was no radiological leak, but in modern war, hitting the neck of the system can be just as decisive as crushing the brain. You choke logistics, disrupt energy, and force the opponent to spend the only asset that can't be recovered: time. I want to state my position here. I'm sympathetic to American and Israeli containment actions when they target networks that export instability. However, I'll add a crucial caveat I'll repeat until I'm tired. Do not confuse extremism with religion. The problem is the political instrumentalization by radicals. Mixing that with Islamic faith is the dumbest propaganda trap, and it hands moral ammunition to those who want to recruit through resentment. The energy pincer and Brazilia's neglect. If there's one place where a spark becomes a global wildfire, it's the Gulf's energy corridor. Logistics panic drives up the price per barrel before it even leaves the ground. And now we have a new and very heavy piece on the board. China has instructed its refineries to suspend new fuel export contracts. Beijing is holding back diesel and gasoline to protect its own domestic market in the face of a global squeeze. That's not conspiracy theory, it's the real market. And what does Brazil do? The government loves to give speeches about food sovereignty, but what do we actually see beyond photos and ready-made slogans? Our agricultural productivity depends on imported fertilizers. When roots choke and energy costs rise abroad, that becomes higher prices on your supermarket shelf at home. While the Middle East boils, another front has opened in the Caucasus. Iran launched drones against the enclave of Nakhchivan, hitting civilian infrastructure and the international airport in Azerbaijan. Tehran denies it, but geography doesn't lie, and Azerbaijan has already promised retaliation. That's how a regional conflict spills over and becomes a chain reaction. Information warfare and European paralysis. Remember, in 2026, the first shot of a battle can be a viral post. Information warfare aims to control the narrative and the legitimacy of the strike. That's why you'll see dramatic maps and bombastic lines everywhere. Russia, for example, accuses the US of trying to drag Arab countries into the conflict while offering itself as a mediator, pure strategic propaganda. China, meanwhile, does what Beijing does best, keeps channels open with everyone to make sure it has a seat at the table when the fire goes out. Because if you're not sitting at the table, you're the one paying the bill. Even Europe, which spent years acting as if war was a thing of the past, is now rushing to protect the Mediterranean and the perimeter around Cyprus. Italy, France, and the United Kingdom are sending ships and missiles, but they keep repeating the standard line: we don't want to enter the war. That's the classic European posture. They're already in the war through logistics and shared risk. They just don't want the label. And in the end, who pays for maritime insurance and expensive freight? It's not diplomacy, it's you, the consumer. Brazil insists on rhetorical neutrality, but the real world doesn't forgive those who depend on external inputs and pretend to be impartial. The empty chair and Doral's message. The White House confirmed the holding of a security summit in Doral, Florida. The goal is clear: to discuss cartels, narco-terrorism, and migration, the issues that truly define the stability of the hemisphere at this moment. The guest list includes nearly everyone: Argentina, Chile, Paraguay, Ecuador, even Honduras and Trinidad and Tobago. But do you know who was left out? Brazil. This is not a mere protocol detail or a scheduling oversight. In a world under stress, nobody invites out of courtesy. Invitations are extended based on trust, convergence, and strategic utility. Being outside the room where regional security is decided is an unmistakable sign of political weakness. It's the price of diplomacy that prefers ideological performance over real protection. The Brazilian government condemns American and Israeli containment actions, repeating the mantra that negotiation is the only way, but forgets that neutrality is expensive when one depends on the real world for technology and resources. Worse, it seems the goal is to force a side to be chosen, and we all know which side that is, the one of the Russian bear and the Chinese dragon. The maze of institutions and legal opacity. While foreign policy flounders, Congress tries to send a sign of life by approving the EU-Mercosur agreement. It's a huge pact. It could open markets, but it's not a magic wand. In a hybrid war scenario, trade only becomes a force if there is internal resilience, robust logistics, and above all, legal certainty. And it's precisely here that Brazil slips. Look at what happened at the STJ, Superior Court of Justice. The special court rejected the follow-up of a letter rogatory to summon Minister Alexandre de Moraes in a process running in the US, filed by Rumble and Trump media. What catches my attention is that this was decided in a confidential procedure, behind closed doors. Technically, there may be a legal basis, but politically, it's gasoline on the debate about transparency. Denying the rogatory doesn't erase the process abroad. It only reinforces the external perception of opacity and a system that shields itself. The business world and investors are watching this institutional noise and taking notes. Digital surveillance and society's oxygen. As part of the relationship between the state and the citizen, the Ministry of Tourism decided to extend the obligation of the Digital National Hotel Guest Registration, FNRH Digital. The debate isn't about digitalization itself, but about who has access to this data, for how long, and with what safeguards. In a country with a history of leaks and political instrumentalization, asking for detailed data on every citizen who stays at a hotel becomes explosive. And if the issue is daily life, we have the STF, Supreme Federal Court, debating whether electricity is not essential in all situations, within disputes over the ICMS tax. Looking from outside Brazil, this seems delusional. In a country where justice is digital, banking is an app, and work is online, electricity is a structural right. When legal language disconnects from real life like this, what emerges is a devastating institutional disbelief. The world in arms, lessons on real sovereignty. While Brazil gets lost in these discussions, serious powers are preparing for the worst. The UK has just announced a $1 billion contract with Leonardo to produce military helicopters, securing jobs and maintaining its strategic industrial base. They understood that sovereignty isn't discourse. Sovereignty is a working factory and an active defense production line. In the Indo-Pacific, Japan is moving toward a counter-strike posture, installing long-range missiles and reinforcing intelligence. It's not Japan becoming aggressive. It's Japan reacting to an environment that has decayed, realizing that deterrence needs to be real and credible to work. At the same time, China maintains its patrols in the South China Sea, accusing the Philippines of disturbing the peace just for carrying out joint patrols with other countries. It's the permanent regional Cold War, a dispute for presence and narrative. Deterrence and crime in the digital underworld. And for those who think nuclear war is just a theory, the US Air Force conducted a Minuteman III GT-255 test. They say it's been planned for years, but in a world with power recalibration, this is a credibility message. It's pure deterrence, showing that the club works so no one has the temptation to escalate. Even Australia, which avoids direct-eye military operations, has already sent planes for consular support and repatriation. They don't opine, they act because the real world doesn't wait for political debates to mature. On the digital front, the US Department of Justice and Europol took down Leakbase, a giant forum used to sell stolen data. This is national security. Stolen credentials fuel fraud, blackmail, and can disrupt critical infrastructures like power grids or telecommunications. While the West treats cybercrime as a strategic threat, Brazil still seems to treat cybersecurity as an IT detail. I end this segment with a metaphor for the collapse of civility. United Airlines now allows the removal of passengers who listen to audio without headphones. It may seem trivial, but it's the picture of institutions trying to enforce rules where common sense has failed. In Brazil, the institutional noise is so loud that we can't even hear what's essential: legal security, energy, and respect for the citizen who pays the bill. The question I leave for Brasilia, which should guide every decision made in those offices, is simple. Does Brazil want to be an actor or an audience? Because today, while the planet arms itself, groups, and recalculates risks at a brutal speed, Brazil runs the real risk of becoming a large country with a tiny voice. And it's not for lack of size or resources, but because of an excess of ideological vanity and a chronic lack of institutional predictability. In 2026, predictability is worth more than gold. In a world under shock, no one invests heavily where the rules change according to the mood of the week, where critical decisions are made in secrecy, and where the citizen is treated as a mere statistical detail. The invisible heart. Energy as the war tax. Many still think of energy only as the price they see on the gas station's display, but this is a basic misreading. Energy is the invisible heart of this entire conflict. It's the freight cost built into the rice and beans you buy. It's the cost of fertilizer, which depends on gas, logistics, and factories running at full capacity. Energy is what separates an economy that works from one that spirals into collapse. When China signals it will hold back its fuel and reduce exports, it is telling the world it fears a prolonged squeeze and has decided to protect its domestic market. In practice, this pushes the problem onto everyone else. Other countries end up paying more, scrambling for shipments desperately and raising risk premiums. It's actually a war tax imposed on the rest of the planet, including on us. And the Brazilian pays this tax even when Brasilia pretends neutrality. Neutrality doesn't create cheap diesel or guarantee clear roads. In times of shock, it only gives us the right to pay the bill without complaining. The homework we're not doing is boring, technical, and requires planning, strategic stockpiles, supplier diversification, and a real fertilizer strategy. But what we see is an external posture that turns Brazil into a difficult-to-trust partner for those building secure chains. No one insures with those who play with moral ambiguity to please internal tribes. The message from Doral and the crisis of trust. I return to the episode of the summit in Doral, Florida. Brazil not appearing on that list is not political gossip. It's a message of alignment and priority on the issue that matters most to the United States right now: internal security, criminal networks, and migration. Brazil has ceased to be seen as a central player. This should hurt any government that calls itself strategic. The problem is that the current government prefers symbolic gestures over concrete results, such as real cooperation in combating transnational crime. And this lack of trust spills over into our legal system. When the world reads that the STJ, Superior Court of Justice, rejected in secrecy a letter rogatory linked to international processes, the message left abroad is one of opacity and corporatism. In this environment of global tension, form becomes content. The perception is that the system shields itself. Our institutional culture loves secrecy as a power tool and hates transparency as an obligation. And this is a breeding ground for campaigns to undermine and reputational sanctions against our interests. The war of platforms and digital oxygen. Modern warfare has a front that is cultural, legal, and digital. American platforms against Brazilian rules, orders with cross-border effects. This is new international trade. It's no longer just about tariffs and containers, but knowing where the power of the state ends and digital jurisdiction begins. Brazil is in the middle of this hurricane without a clear strategy. There's reaction, there's punishment, but there isn't a stable framework that the world interprets as the rule of law. Without that, there is no long-term investment. It's almost comical, if it weren't tragic, that while the powers discuss nuclear deterrence, Brazil discusses hotel guest registries and whether energy is essential. When the state demands digital registrations without presenting robust safeguards in a country where data leaks are routine, citizens have every right to suspect. And on energy, the public perception is devastating. Brazilians know that in a world where everything, from banking to schooling, is digital, energy is the oxygen of society. Discussing the opposite is playing with the credibility of the state. Internal capture and national security. We can't ignore our internal weaknesses, such as the scandals affecting the financial sector and suspicions of intimidation and corruption networks. When the outside world is unstable, any internal crack is amplified. The investor asks, can the country handle an external crisis without turning it into an internal crisis? Unfortunately, Brazil is showing signs that the external crisis only becomes more ammunition for our domestic wars. Meanwhile, the West treats digital security as national security. The takedown of Leakbase by the FBI and Europol shows that they understood. Stolen data fuels the infrastructure of crime that can paralyze a nation's logistics and energy. In Brazil, we still treat this as a technical IT issue, not as sovereignty. We'll learn the hard way because it seems like that's the only way we learn. Now we enter the spillover zone, the point where the conflict stops being a localized wound and starts infecting the entire system. If you think that what happens in the Middle East stays in the Middle East, think again. We are witnessing what we call spillover in strategy, the contagion of risk. The geopolitical spillover alarm. Look at the case of Nakhchivan. When Iranian drones hit civilian infrastructure in an Azerbaijani enclave, or when Europe mobilizes around Cyprus to protect the Mediterranean perimeter, the world is telling us something. These are not isolated events. They are symptoms that the risk has become prolonged and, above all, contagious. When China holds back fuel and Australia sends military planes to evacuate citizens from risk zones, the message is clear. The planet is behaving as if worsening is inevitable. No one moves this way if they believe this will end tomorrow. The powers move today to avoid being surprised by the chaos of the day after tomorrow. Brazil is obscene. It's a harsh message that we have stopped being seen as a central piece of strategic trust. Being outside the room where the agenda of our own region is defined is not a mere protocol detail. It's a sign of deep political weakening. Worse than external isolation is our internal fragility. While the world discusses sovereignty through helicopter factories and long-range missiles, we get lost in institutional squabbles and legal opacity. When the STJ, Superior Court of Justice, decides, in secrecy, to reject a letter rogatory from the US, the image we project to the world is one of a system that shields itself and avoids transparency. In times of global war, institutional reputation is an asset as valuable as oil. The final verdict: roots, energy, and narrative. To conclude this analysis, we need to understand the three pillars that will define who controls the new world being born amidst the flames. Who controls the roots controls the cost of life. The maritime route is the vein through which the world breathes. If insurance rises and the ship diverts, the deadline bursts and inflation shows up. Brazil, dependent on external inputs, is the first to suffer from these bottlenecks. Who controls energy controls resistance. Energy in 2026 is not just a commodity, it's a political weapon. China has already realized this and is preparing for a world where fuel will be used to dictate who can or cannot produce. Brazil, unfortunately, prefers to manage domestic narratives rather than manage real energy risks. Who controls the narrative controls legitimacy. In this hybrid war, the timeline is a trench. The narrative decides who the aggressor is and who has the right to defend themselves. Those who lack method and are carried away by viral cuts end up being involuntary soldiers of psychological operations. The new world will be shaped by those who keep roots open and institutions reliable. Brazil urgently needs to decide whether it wants to be a strategic actor or just an audience paying a very expensive ticket to watch the spectacle of its own irrelevance. True sovereignty is not made with beautiful speeches about peace. It is made with guaranteed energy, legal security, and the ability to be trusted when speaking. Finally, let's talk about something that bothers and many prefer to turn a blind eye to: global conflicts fueled by religious intolerance. An epidemic of violence threatening the world. In an increasingly interconnected world, armed conflicts in regions such as Africa and Southeast Asia are not isolated. They are often driven by religious and ethnic intolerance, resulting in thousands of deaths, mass displacements, and regional instability. These patterns of violence echo global concerns, including the recent war between the US, Israel, and Iran, seen by some as a measure to contain the proliferation of religious extremism as an uncontrollable epidemic. This article examines three persistent conflicts in Sudan, Myanmar, and South Sudan, highlighting their roots in religious and ethnic divisions and how they connect to broader tensions in the Middle East. The civil war in Sudan, approaching 3 years of atrocities in Darfur. The civil war in Sudan between the Sudanese Armed Forces, SAF, and the Rapid Support Forces, RSF, began in April 2023 and is now approaching its third anniversary, with over 1,000 days of brutal fighting. Recent reports highlight atrocities in Darfur, where the RSF has been accused of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and signs of genocide against non-Arab communities such as the Zagawa and Fur. A UN report from February 2026 documents that, during the RSF's capture of El Fasher in October 2025, thousands were killed in summary executions, rapes, and ethnic torture, with at least 6,000 victims in just 3 days. The conflict has displaced millions, with repercussions for Chad, where Sudanese refugees face growing insecurity. Despite a fragile hope for peace in 2026, driven by US sanctions against RSF commanders and UN appeals for accountability, both sides maintain deep motives to continue. control of resources such as gold and agricultural land, as well as ethnic and religious alliances. The RSF, with roots in Arab militias, has perpetuated patterns of violence dating back to the Darfur genocide in the 2000s. Without decisive interventions, the risk of more genocidal violence remains grave and ongoing, according to the UN Human Rights Chief. Myanmar. 5 years after the coup, fraudulent elections worsened the crisis. 5 years after the 2021 military coup, Myanmar is sinking deeper into chaos. The elections, controlled by the junta, held in phases between 2025 and 2026, were widely condemned as fraudulent, with the military proxy party, USGP, winning the majority of seats in a process marked by electoral violence, repression, and low participation, around 54%. Critics, including the UN, described the election as a sham to legitimize the regime, exacerbating the polarization and intense civil war that has already displaced millions. The brutal repression includes mass arrests, airstrikes against civilians, and human rights violations, with 170 civilians killed in bombings since December 2025. The crisis has worsened with the military's control over territories, while armed ethnic groups and resistance forces continue fighting. The persecution of the Rohingya, a Muslim minority, exemplifies underlying religious intolerance, with attacks forcing hundreds of thousands to flee to Bangladesh. South Sudan. Risk of returning to total civil war with clashes at the border. In South Sudan, the risk of returning to full-scale civil war is imminent, with recent clashes killing hundreds near the border with Sudan. Since December 2025, fighting between the South Sudan People's Defense Forces, SSPDF, and the Sudan People's Liberation Army, SPLA-IO, opposition, allied with militias such as the White Army, has displaced nearly 280,000 people in Jonglei and Upper Nile. Attacks include airstrikes and violations against civilians, with 189 deaths in January 2026. The spillover from the Sudanese conflict aggravates instability, with ethnic tensions between Dinka and Nuer fueling violence. The UN warns of a dangerous point that could lead to mass atrocity crimes, undermining the 2018 peace agreement. Religious intolerance, killing thousands and connecting conflicts to Iran. Religious intolerance is a common thread in these conflicts, killing thousands annually. In Sudan, ethnic religious attacks in Darfur echo past genocides. In Myanmar, the persecution of the Muslim Rohingya by a Buddhist majority leads to massacres and exile. In South Sudan, tribal divisions with religious connotations, Christians and enemies versus others, fuel the cycle of violence. Globally, Christian persecution is prominent, with 365 million facing high discrimination and 4,998 deaths for faith-related reasons in 2023, 90% in Nigeria. Regions like the Sahel see Islamic extremism killing thousands, while in India, attacks on Christians and Muslims by nationalist Hindus result in dozens of deaths. This epidemic of intolerance, combined with modern technologies and authoritarianism, drives wars. One of the reasons cited for the US-Israel war against Iran in February 2026 is exactly to contain this proliferation of extremism. The attack, which killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, was justified as an action to neutralize the terrorist regime of Iran, seen as a financier of Shiite extremist groups spreading global intolerance. Critics argue that this reflects a moral mission against extremism, but risks reproducing cycles of religious violence. These conflicts illustrate how religious intolerance not only kills thousands, but also destabilizes entire regions, with global economic and humanitarian impacts. The war with Iran highlights the fear that extremism will spread like an epidemic, but sustainable solutions require diplomacy, accountability, and protection of minorities. Without this, 2026 may see more bloodshed in the name of divided beliefs. Thank you for staying with us. I know I am harsh sometimes, but the current world demands proper argumentation. We can no longer hide behind a colorful, Instagrammable world while the circus is on fire and the lion tamers kill the lions little by little. We are not Brazilians, Americans, Asians, or Vikings. We are humans. And if we allow it, armed animals will take over this planet and we will all become mere slaves to intolerance. Sleep well, if you can. I am Sebastian Barbosa, and this was Nostradamus X News.